What if I told you that somewhere off the coast of Scotland, there's a bell that should never ring? What if I told you that this bell has been calling things from the depths for over 300 years, and that every time it sounds, something crawls out of the ocean that was never meant to walk on land? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most disturbing maritime mysteries ever recorded. This is the story of Dunmore Island, a forgotten piece of rock in the North Sea, and the cursed bell that turned a thriving fishing community into a graveyard of secrets that the Scottish government still refuses to acknowledge. But before we begin, I need to warn you, what you're about to hear will change how you think about the ocean forever. Because sometimes, the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones we imagine lurking in the deep. Sometimes, they're the ones we invite to shore. The year was 1723. King George I ruled Britain, and the age of exploration was giving way to an era of colonial expansion. But on a remote island called Dunmore, barely 3 miles long and inhabited by fewer than 200 souls, time seemed to move differently. The islanders lived as their ancestors had for centuries, fishing the treacherous waters of the North Sea, and praying to survive each winter storm. Dunmore was connected to the mainland by nothing but hope and a single supply ship that visited twice a year. The islanders were hardy people, descended from Viking settlers who had claimed this barren rock 8 centuries earlier. They spoke a dialect so thick that even other Scots could barely understand them. And they kept to traditions that the outside world had long forgotten. At the heart of their community stood St. Columba's Chapel, a stone building so old that no one remembered who had built it. And in the bell tower of that chapel hung a bronze bell unlike any other in Scotland. The bell was massive, nearly 6 feet tall, and covered in symbols that predated Christianity by millennia. Local legend claimed it had been forged not by human hands, but by the sea itself, cast from bronze that had been blessed by creatures that dwelled in the deepest trenches of the ocean. The islanders called it An Clagmara, the sea bell, for generations. The sea bell had served a single, terrible purpose. It rang only during the worst storms, when the waves grew so violent that they threatened to wash the entire island back into the sea. And when it rang, something always answered. The first recorded incident happened on October 13, 1723. A merchant named Thomas Blackwood had been stranded on Dunmore when an early winter storm caught his trading vessel in the harbour. In his journal, which survived in the archives of Edinburgh University until it mysteriously disappeared in 1976, Blackwood described a night that haunted him for the rest of his life. The storm had been building for 3 days, with waves reaching heights that the oldest islanders claimed they had never seen. The wind howled like a living thing, and by the 3rd night, several houses near the shore had already been claimed by the hungry tide. That's when the bell began to ring. Blackwood wrote that the sound was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't the clear, bright tone you would expect from a church bell. Instead, it produced a deep, resonant note that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath the earth. The sound didn't fade like a normal bell, but sustained itself, growing louder and more complex until it seemed like hundreds of voices were singing in harmony. But what happened next defied everything Blackwood thought he knew about the natural world. As the bell continued to ring, the storm began to change. The violent winds started to move in patterns, as if they were being conducted by an invisible hand. The waves, which had been crashing randomly against the shore, began to form geometric shapes, spiraling inward toward the island like a massive whirlpool. And then, from the center of that whirlpool, something began to rise. Blackwood described it as a mass of writhing tentacles and glistening flesh, easily the size of a 3-story building. But this wasn't just some unknown sea creature. As it pulled itself onto the shore, Blackwood realized that parts of it looked almost human. There were faces embedded in the mass, dozens of them, with expressions of terrible anguish. And strangest of all, these faces were speaking, crying out in languages that predated human civilization. The creature moved through the village like a living flood, but it didn't destroy anything. Instead, it seemed to be searching, extending tendrils into every house, every shed, every hiding place on the island. and wherever it searched, it left something behind. Blackwood watched in horror as the islanders emerged from their homes, but they were no longer entirely human. Their eyes had changed, becoming deep black orbs that reflected light like the surface of still water. Their skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and when they spoke, their voices carried that same otherworldly harmony that had emanated from the bell. The creature remained on the island for exactly 3 hours. When it finally retreated back into the sea, the storm died instantly, leaving behind a night so calm and clear that Blackwood could see every star in the sky. But the islanders were forever changed. Over the following weeks, as Blackwood waited for a ship to rescue him, he documented the transformation of Dunmore's population. The islanders no longer needed to fish for food. Instead, they would simply walk to the shore at low tide, and the ocean would provide for them. Fish would beach themselves by the hundreds, and strange luminescent plants would wash ashore. Plants that provided more nutrition than any earthly vegetation. But the most disturbing change was in the children. Every woman on the island was suddenly pregnant, regardless of age or previous fertility. And when these children were born, 3 months later, they were not entirely human. Blackwood's journal describes infants with webbed fingers and gills along their necks, children who could breathe underwater for hours and who seemed to understand the language of the sea itself. And all of them had those same black, reflective eyes. The merchant finally escaped Dunmore in the spring of 1724, when a passing whaling ship spotted his signal fires. But the story he told was so unbelievable that most people dismissed it as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation. However, Blackwood's account was not the only record of strange events on Dunmore Island. Shiplogs from the 18th and 19th centuries contain dozens of reports of vessels that attempted to land on Dunmore during storms, only to encounter inhabitants who were decidedly not human. These reports were typically buried in official files and dismissed as sailors' tales. But the consistency of the details is remarkable. Captain James Morrison of the HMS Intrepid reported in 1806 that he had attempted to shelter at Dunmore during a severe gale, only to discover that the islanders could breathe underwater and communicated with the local sea life. His crew watched in amazement as children no older than 10 years old swam to depths that should have crushed their lungs. Returning with treasures from shipwrecks that had been lost for centuries, Lieutenant William Hayes documented an even more disturbing encounter in 18. His ship, the merchant vessel Mary Catherine, was nearly wrecked in a storm when they spotted the lights of Dunmore Island. But when they approached the shore, they discovered that the lights were not coming from lanterns or fires. Instead, the islanders themselves were glowing with a cold blue radiance that emanated from beneath their skin. Hayes wrote that the islanders invited his crew to wait out the storm in their homes. But something about their hospitality felt wrong. The houses smelled of brine and decay, and the food they offered seemed to move on the plates, as if it was still alive. Most disturbing of all, Hayes noticed that none of the islanders seemed to breathe in the normal way. Their chests would rise and fall, but there was no visible vapor from their breath. Even in the cold air, when Hayes asked about the strange bell in their chapel, the islanders became agitated. They explained, in their thick dialect, that the bell was their protector, their connection to the old ones who dwelled in the deepest parts of the ocean. They claimed that as long as the bell continued to ring during storms, their island would never be destroyed by the sea. But they also hinted at a darker truth, that this protection came at a price that outsiders could never understand. Hayes and his crew left Dunmore as soon as the storm passed, but not before witnessing the bell ring one more time. He described the sound as indescribable, like the cry of something vast and ancient that had been sleeping beneath the waves since before humans walked the earth. But perhaps the most chilling account comes from Dr. Elizabeth Marsh, a naturalist who visited Dunmore in 1879 as part of a scientific expedition to catalogue the flora and fauna of Scotland's remote islands. Dr. Marsh was a woman of science, skeptical of superstition, and focused on observable facts. She came to Dunmore expecting to find nothing more than an isolated community struggling to survive in harsh conditions. What she discovered, instead, challenged everything she believed about the natural world. Her detailed notes, preserved in the Royal Society archives, describe a population that had evolved beyond normal human parameters. The islanders possessed respiratory systems that allowed them to process oxygen from water as efficiently as from air. Their bone density was significantly higher than normal humans, allowing them to withstand the crushing pressure of deep water. And most remarkably, they seemed to have developed a form of echolocation, navigating in complete darkness by producing subsonic sounds that normal humans couldn't hear. But Dr. Marsh's scientific curiosity led her to make a discovery that nearly cost her life. While exploring the island's coastline, she discovered a series of underwater caves that extended far beneath the island's foundation. Using primitive diving equipment, she descended into these caves and found something that defied all logic. The caves were not natural formations. Instead, they were clearly artificial, carved from the living rock with precision that surpassed any human engineering. The walls were covered with the same symbols that decorated the sea bell. Symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. But more disturbing were the contents of these caves. Dr. Marsh found chambers filled with what she initially thought were religious artifacts, but closer examination revealed that these objects were not made by human hands. Instead, they appeared to be organic, grown rather than crafted, with surfaces that felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. In the deepest chamber, she discovered the source of the island's power. It was a pool of water that connected to the open ocean through a series of tunnels. But the water itself was unlike anything on Earth. It glowed with the same cold blue light that she had observed in the islanders, and when she tested a sample, she found that it contained microorganisms that didn't match any known species. More disturbing still, the water seemed to be alive, in a way that transcended simple biology. It responded to her presence, forming patterns and shapes that almost resembled communication. And when she held her hand above its surface, she could feel it calling to her. Promising knowledge and power beyond human understanding, Dr. Marsh managed to escape the caves, but not unchanged. Her own notes, written weeks later, describe physical alterations that began almost immediately after her exposure to the strange water. Her eyesight improved dramatically, allowing her to see clearly in near total darkness. Her lung capacity increased, and she found that she could hold her breath for nearly 20 minutes without discomfort. But the most disturbing change was psychological. She began to understand the islanders' dialect without having learned it. And more frightening still, she started to hear the ocean calling to her. Especially during storms, Dr. Marsh left Dunmore after only 2 weeks, cutting her planned month-long study short. But her final report, submitted to the Royal Society in 1880, was so disturbing that it was immediately classified and hidden from public view. According to leaked portions of that report, Dr. Marsh concluded that the islanders of Dunmore were no longer entirely human. Instead, they were something new, a hybrid species created through centuries of exposure to influences from the deepest parts of the ocean. And she warned that whatever force had created them was not content to remain confined to one small island. Last official record of life on Dunmore Island comes from 1912, when a government survey ship visited the island to update nautical charts. The surveyors found the island completely abandoned, with no sign of what had happened to its inhabitants. The houses stood empty but undamaged, as if the entire population had simply walked into the sea one day and never returned. Personal belongings remained where they had been left, food was still preserved in storage areas, and the chapel stood intact with its mysterious bell still hanging in the tower. But the surveyors made one disturbing discovery. In the church records, they found birth and death certificates dating back nearly 2 centuries. And according to these records, no one had died of natural causes on Dunmore Island in over 150 years. Instead, when the islanders reached a certain age, usually around 70 years old, they would simply disappear. Always during a storm, always when the bell was ringing. The government classified the survey report and declared Dunmore Island off limits to civilian vessels. Officially, the restriction was due to dangerous currents and unstable geological conditions. But former military personnel who served on patrol boats in the area tell a different story. They speak of nights when the bell can still be heard ringing across the water. Even though no one lives on the island anymore, they describe strange lights beneath the waves, moving in patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. And they tell of sonar readings that show massive shapes moving in the deep water around the island. Shapes that are too large and too organized to be any known sea creature. In 1976, a team of marine biologists attempted to conduct an unauthorized study of the waters around Dunmore. Their research vessel, the Deep Explorer, was found 3 weeks later, drifting empty off the coast of Norway. The entire crew had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their research notes and a series of underwater photographs that the authorities immediately confiscated. But one photograph survived, hidden by a crew member's family, and eventually leaked to researchers in the 1990s. The image, taken at a depth of 300 feet near Dunmore Island, shows something that marine biologists claim is impossible. It's a city. Not ruins, not remains, but a living, thriving city built on the ocean floor. The structures are clearly artificial, but they don't follow any human architectural principles. Instead, they seem to grow organically from the seabed, spiraling upward in impossible curves and angles that hurt to look at directly. And moving through this underwater metropolis are figures that might once have been human, but have adapted to their aquatic environment in ways that challenge our understanding of evolution itself. They move through the water with grace and purpose, tending to structures that glow with their own internal light and communicating through methods that our science cannot begin to comprehend. The most chilling detail in the photograph is visible. In the city's center, where a massive bell tower rises from the depths, and at the top of that tower hangs a bell identical to the one that still hangs in the abandoned chapel on Dunmore Island. Because you see, the islanders didn't disappear. They simply returned to where they had always belonged, to the city beneath the waves that had been calling to them for centuries. And according to the few researchers brave enough to study this mystery, they're still there, still thriving, still growing in numbers. And every time a storm passes over Dunmore Island, every time that cursed bell rings across the empty waters, something answers from the depths. Not to destroy or to conquer, but to invite. To call others to join them in their underwater paradise. To trade their humanity for something far older and more powerful. The Scottish government maintains that Dunmore Island is uninhabitable due to geological instability. They warn that the currents around the island are too dangerous for small boats, and that the rocky shores make landing impossible during rough weather. But the truth is far more disturbing. The island remains off-limits because every few years, someone manages to land there during a storm, and when they do, they hear the bell ringing, they feel the call of the deep waters, and they make a choice that transforms them into something that humanity was never meant to become. The last documented case occurred in 2003, when a fishing vessel called the Northern Pride was reported missing during a severe storm. Coast Guard records show that the boat's emergency beacon was last detected near Dunmore Island, but search efforts were called off after only 48 hours due to hazardous conditions. However, 3 months later, commercial fishermen working the North Sea began reporting encounters with people who seemed to be living underwater near the site where the Northern Pride had vanished. These people appeared healthy and unharmed, but they moved through the water like dolphins, staying submerged for impossible lengths of time and communicating through sounds that resembled whale song more than human speech. The fishermen tried to rescue these apparent survivors, but every attempt failed. The water-adapted humans would approach close enough to be clearly visible, but they would retreat the moment any rescue boat tried to reach them. It was as if they were no longer interested in returning to the surface world. One fisherman, whose account was buried in Coast Guard files, reported that he had recognized one of the water dwellers as his own cousin, a crew member of the Northern Pride. But when he called out the man's name, the figure in the water had turned to look at him with eyes that were completely black, reflective like a shark's, and utterly without recognition of his former human life. Today, Dunmore Island sits empty. In the North Sea, its chapel bell silent in the tower, waiting for the next storm to wake it from its slumber. Marine traffic gives the island a wide berth, not because of official restrictions, but because experienced sailors know that some places are not meant for surface dwellers. But on nights when the weather turns violent, when the waves grow tall, enough to swallow ships, and the wind howls with ancient fury, those same sailors report hearing something that chills them to the bone. It's the sound of a bell ringing in the distance, deep and resonant and completely impossible, calling out across the waves to whatever waits in the depths below. And sometimes, just sometimes, they see lights beneath the water, moving in response to that otherworldly chime, lights that suggest a vast civilization thriving in the crushing depths, populated by beings that once walked on land, but chose something far more profound and terrible. The bell that called things from the sea still hangs in its tower, waiting for the next storm, the next opportunity to extend its ancient invitation. Because the deepest truth about Dunmore Island is not that it was abandoned by its inhabitants. The truth is that they found something better, and they're still down there, in their impossible city beneath the waves, waiting for others brave enough, or desperate enough to answer the call of the sea bell, waiting to share the dark gift that transforms mere humans into something magnificent and terrifying, and utterly alien to everything we thought we knew about life on this planet. The next time you find yourself near the ocean during a storm, listen carefully. You might just hear it too. The bell that calls things from the sea, and you'll have to decide whether that call is a warning to stay away, or an invitation to come home. Some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Some doors should never be opened, and some bells should never be answered. But for those who hear the call of the deep waters, for those who feel the pull of something vast and ancient beneath the waves, the choice has already been made. The sea remembers everything, and it never stops calling its children home.